doing ongoing work on forest transitions that are sort of in a staple, and increasingly, and also population and health, and increasingly sort of starting to try to unpack the different health components. So some of this is largely hand-waving, and some of it is actually based on some real research, and some of it's conceptual. And so this is a small informal group too, so I really look forward to your feedback. And it's kind of a hodgepodge of sort of different projects, and I've kind of tried to put them together to think about, well, what are these kind of meaning, and what are these building towards potentially for coupled forest and nutrition transitions. Largely, of course, as part of the demographic transition in many ways. So there's kind of two big frame concepts here. One is that available agricultural land is a diminishing, constraining resource, and human land relations are critically linked to demography, health, economic sustainability, and environmental integrity and conservation. And I'm a geographer, so space and scale are really important, and I hope that that comes out in this talk. So I'm going to talk about the big picture, continental scale, and then hone into really household level, and show how some of these things may be similar in different scales. Couple of framing concepts for pop environment. So despite rapid urbanization right now in the developing world, remote rural demographic transitions will have a disproportionate effect on future population size and distribution. And it's what we know least about. How does this link to land? Kind of in a sentence, or you phrase this as a question: how many people eating what, produced where, will describe the vast majority of future land changes on the face of the earth? So some current projects, population, health, environment, land change, and also I'm at UC Santa Barbara, so also doing some work on coastal systems. If you're interested in any of these or publications, a bunch of them are online on my website. We'll talk about these later. So again, urbanization is a big trend, and whereas so much of the population growth happened already in the developed regions up until the turn of this most recent century, you can see the vast bulk of population growth that's going on in the developing regions. This is something that probably this audience is well aware of. But what's really fascinating, and I think even people that know population, know public health, many people aren't aware that according to UN projections, the net increase of the world's population will be solely isolated to the world's poorest cities from here to 2050. So it's not just population growth in developing countries anymore, it's population growth in poor cities. So where are they going to be? How fast will that transition occur? And what will they be eating, produce how, produce where? It's going to describe the vast majority of land changes on the face of the earth. Why Travel Deforestation? Well, because it's by far the largest imprint of human occupation of the Earth's surface. So if we go back to 8,000 years, dawn of the agricultural revolution, this is what our stance at the time. Old growth forests look like more or less, and today we have really just a fraction of that, with the Amazon dominating. And almost all of this change is forest conversion to agriculture. So even with rapid urbanization, and even though since a couple years ago we're now 50% urban, less than 1% of the global Earth's surface is in urban or settled areas. The rest that's human occupied is largely converted to agriculture. So this is about demographic transitions, and space and scale matter. This is work I did with USAID and WWF. So this is a map that I put together where I basically put together different aspects of demographic transition, including fertility and mortality indicators, and sort of put them on a scale, relative scale along the demographic transition, from very far along, such as southern South Africa, Cape Town, to scarcely initiated. And you can see that, in one area you have, so much of sub-Saharan Africa is very early in the demographic transition, but other parts are much more like the developed countries. That's maybe not so surprising to people, but what might be more surprising to any of you Latin Americanists is that, we think of Latin America as already very urbanized, 80% urban. Many of the countries now completed the fertility transition, but there's still pockets of Latin America, if you get down to the municipal scale and sub-provincial scale, that are very early in demographic transition. Parts of the Andes, parts of Central America, and Guatemala is salient in this, very early stages of demographic transition, including the nutrition transition. This is work that Bill Penn and I did in Ecuador. I'm going to go through this really quickly. Really, the point of this is ongoing work that we've done, since the 80s on deforestation in the Amazon. Dick Billsborough, PI. The point that I want to make here is these two pictures. This is Lago Agrio. Total fertility rate under 4 now. This is, you just cross the river. In the indigenous community, total fertility rate is over 7. Who do we have data on? These people. Who do we not have data on? These people. And so the timing, pace, and magnitude of the demographic transition of those remote rural populations is something we know so little about, but represents probably much of that error bar of the unknown of how many people will live on the planet, and thus what they'll be eating, ultimately, where, and thus how they will impact forest transitions. Another thing just to highlight from this research that Professor Penn and I did is that when you are living in a remote rural area, your impact on the land is very intimate in space and time. So when we were looking at relationships with fertility, we saw that change in land was significant. And this is something that once you have made this demographic transition to urban areas, of course, you're eating food that's produced elsewhere, and that relationship between things like nutrition and fertility, for example, aren't so intimate in space and time with land transitions. Okay, so from proximate human-environment interactions in space and time, rural and local, to distal processes related to demographic transitions, urban and global, how does declining rural fertility, for example, and this last research that I just very glibly went over, relate to the global forest and nutrition transitions? Again, a lot of this is conceptual right now, and I think this is sort of, in a way, sort of ideas for research agenda. But one big thing that's going on is you have fewer local consumers and producers coupled with rapid urbanization, and this, again, is leading to a dislocation of production and consumption processes. So what does this mean? You might be familiar with our colleague at the Population Center, Barry Popkin, defining nutrition transition as quality of life and access to modern goods and services. As this increases, households begin to shift to a Western diet, high in processed foods containing sugar, starch, fat, and salt. So, what does this mean for forest transitions? And let's give the example of Latin America, which is where I do have some data to show, and where forest transitions are quite dramatic and compelling. So, in terms of the urban transition, again, great variation. We basically have 2 worlds right now. 2 developing worlds, essentially. We have part of the developing world that we're still sort of maybe calling developing, and maybe we shouldn't, like the Cono Sur, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, which in many ways is more developed in terms of some of these transitions than the United States, 90% urban, right? Total fertility rates in the 1s. Infant mortality rate rivaling certainly parts of the U.S. Okay. Then you have places like, if you really want to get extreme, sub-Saharan Africa, where you have 15%, urban. Not that extreme in Latin America, but we do have countries in Latin America that are still around 50% urban, 50% rural, places like Guatemala, Ecuador, Bolivia. And those 50% that live in rural areas are largely indigenous, and therefore not Spanish-speaking, and are basically rural peasants having this, again, very early forest transition, early demographic transition, intimate in space and time relationship with the forest and forest transitions. So these 2 worlds that, let me just pause for a second here, because again, a lot of you probably already know this stuff, but this is pretty cool. This is pretty amazing. This is happening now. This never happened before. This won't happen in the future. It's happening right now, this transition. You have places that are 50% urban, places that are 90% urban. We're right smack in the middle of this transition. And so the population dynamics that are unprecedented right now are going to have real dramatic changes, and this is the time to study it. And so this is a big challenge for this research community, but also a big opportunity. In these 2 worlds, and really what I'm talking about here is probably this is sort of the inexorable path that we anticipate. So the question is, how fast will these populations move into this pathway 2? Pathway 1, relationships with the land, high population growth. Rural migration, low technology, low yields, poverty, subsistence, infectious disease. And these things are related. Pathway 2, falling population growth, urbanization, increased meat consumption, high yield agriculture, increasing affluence, high technology, export agriculture, and now people are dying of other stuff like obesity and cancer, heart disease. How fast will this transition to this? Will everyone that's in pathway 1 transition to pathway 2? Do we even know, and can we even map and identify really the full extent of the existing pathway 1 populations? I think that remains another question. And again, I want to emphasize this because I think that so much, besides in popular literature, many researchers, population, demography, public health, land change research, kind of take this urban transition as a fait accompli, without taking into account really that it isn't, frankly. What are some of the implications of this? So, remaining high population growth and persistent host and host vector diseases. I already said this. Pace and magnitude. This group shifting to the second group will have huge implications on population, health, nutrition, and forest transitions. And guess what? We don't really know if it'll mean there'll be more or less deforestation. Given the pace and magnitude of that transition, we just know that it will largely define the contours of that forest transition. How it remains an open question. So, what are some land and forest transitions and implications? I'm going to show you a few slides from research we recently completed on a NSF coupled Natural Human Systems grant, where we basically had land classifications produced from MODIS, in which we did tens of thousands of Google Earth enhanced observations to ground truth the MODIS, and then assigned classifications for the 16,000 plus municipalities, all the municipalities for Latin America, and coupled that with demographic data. And so here's some results from that. This is estimated annual rate of forest change from 2001 to 2010. In the 2,500, more or less, municipalities where there's significant change in our regression models. And you can see it's quite modeled, the pattern. Some areas are actually increasing forest, other areas are losing. The Amazon is sailing in forest loss. How is this related to population? Well, interestingly, as you can see here, since quite a while ago, actually, by the early 90s, the rural population in Latin America started to decline. And the urban population has continued a steady linear ascent upwards. And so we absolutely observed that during the 90s, there was about a quarter of the municipalities that had negative growth. So then what is this relationship between population? One of our initial hypotheses that NSF gave us $1 million to ask is a relationship between local population change and deforestation. So that was one of the first regressions we ran, and that's what we found. Zero. Nada. Thank you, NSF. I'm sorry, but there was no relationship between, we had this lovely R squared of 0.000. It couldn't be more random, this association. Population change, 90 to 2000 at the municipal scale, okay, about 16,000 municipalities, related to forest change. Nothing. Okay, game over, right? So population is unrelated to forest change. We're skeptical. Is it really? Or what else is going on? So first of all, let's tease about some of these patterns. In some places we have, very high deforestation. We know what crops are predominant here. Any ideas? What's growing in these areas? Southern Brazil and northern Argentina, Paraguay. So soybeans for export, also cattle. Okay, what's going on there? Why is it getting greener? People probably have been to this area of Mexico. Somebody here? What does it look like? Think of the southwest U.S. Greener? Well, it's relative, right? It's getting greener. This is arid shrubland. This is a xeric environment. Interestingly, it's getting greener here, and also another, not quite as arid, but certainly xeric environment is northeast Brazil, also getting greener. What's going on there? Any ideas? Totally new? Yeah, go ahead.
Red? Is it?
Red, not like red. Right.
It's great, but does it have to do with? I mean, that's the Atlantic forest, I think. Yeah. So does that have to do with?
No, that's not actually. Atlantic forest is further south. It's like here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Still a little bit green there. I wonder if that has to do
You're right.
with.
That's right. Yeah.
Sort of conservation efforts.
I think
there.
You know what? And no one's mentioned this, so I really appreciate that. I think you may very likely have a point for some of these areas here. I'm going to mention that to my colleagues, so thank you. But both here and here, what we saw was the real signal was increased rainfall. And when it's a pretty arid environment, marginal increased rainfall, you get a big greening effect. Okay, so here along the Andes and also in Central America, we see sort of a different signal of deforestation, but rather than the large sort of soybean export crops, it's still the pathway one. Peasant population growth, small farmer subsistence farming. Still going on. We're still going through this transition. Increasingly this, but still remnants of the pathway one. Okay. So we said, okay.
Question?
Yeah.
Do you not see the like switch to banana plantations, which should be like a green cover, replacing what was deforested? Because I remember
Some places.
so that doesn't show up really in your
Coconut, and also coconut palm plantations.
Yeah.
Things like that.
I mean,
I feel like that's what you would see, certainly in Ecuador. I feel like you
in
would see
Ecuador,
that.
sure. Yep. Yep.
But I didn't know.
It's a great question. You know, we haven't really explored it in depth for Ecuador, and it would be a good question to do that. We have done it for several of the other countries, and some of those patterns have been revealed, yeah. Though usually that's net still, well, yeah. I mean,
Right, so
it's
I'm saying it
complicated.
was
It's
like
more
basically
intensive,
net
but
zero, right? Because you
maybe,
would net.
yeah. I don't know that it's intuitive which way it would go. Yeah. So then, okay, a couple things. At the municipal level, for all of Latin America, there was no relationship between population change and forest change. However, when we tease, places apart of different biomes, different forest change patterns, we do see in some places that population growth is very related to deforestation, but it's that pathway one, and other places none. When you put them all and group them all together, these different areas at different stages of transition, it's just big noise. Point one, related to this is scale. Bill Penn will definitely be familiar with this. So yeah, we control for municipal size. Nonetheless, when you have 16,000 observations, you have obviously the smaller ones, are going to have more weight in your sample, and the most remote rural frontiers that have high deforestation and rapid population growth, even if low initial population, tend to be large municipalities. So that's something to also factor in. So, but we did control for that, and we thought that would solve our problem. It didn't. But scale is something to take into account. Second thing,
Why don't you use
yeah.
the gridded population?
The ground.
The gridded, yeah.
Yeah, except that we had better data for the municipal level. So, we did that. But yes, we could do that as well, and we had it. That would be
Because then
interesting.
you can match that with your pixels better.
Yep, it's it'd be 1 kilometer, so we lose some resolution in the forest change, but it might be worth exploring. Another point is that as we see this increasing shift to the pathway 2, the soybean expansion, for example, coconut palm and banana plantation expansion in South America, it's really not an issue of local population change, is it? It's not necessarily an issue of local anything change, including economic or nutrition. It might be that it's becoming global. So we just started to look at this. We said, well, let's look at South American soybean production, 94 to 2010. Goes up quite dramatically. And let's look at global pig and poultry production. Also goes up fairly linearly. All right. And then we look. So who's buying this? Where's this going? So we did a multi-level regression. State and biome were also important predictors for deforestation at the municipal level in Latin America. But very important variables that emerged were beef production and soy production, and also remittances and foreign investment, GDP, all things that are related to consumption and export crops. And we saw that beef was the largest predictor. Beef exports, beef production at the national scale for forest clearing at the municipal level, and that soy was also an important predictor along with GDP and remittances. So we unpacked this a little bit further, and we asked ourselves, using FAO data, well, where are these exports going? And you can see that the imports of Latin American beef are going to these countries. It's quite diverse. And the beef production is led globally by Brazil, followed by several other Latin American countries. We look at soy imports by country. You can see that Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, and Paraguay dominate. Look, China really stands out in terms of soy imports. And so really the big story is essentially that it's not that population perhaps has no effect on forest change, but that urbanization and thus rising affluence in, for example, China, has increasingly a bit large impact on forest change in Latin America. Exports of beef and cattle, Brazil, again, leads the globe, and we have other countries such as Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay that are also among the global leaders. So again, population trends are quite related to forest trends, it appears, but increasingly with greater distance in space and time between those population drivers and land change outcomes. And whereas in terms of the migration transition, it was a rural-rural pattern, now it's a rural-urban pattern, but elsewhere.
So I was wondering, when you talk about forest change, if the way you're measuring it, you're actually lumping up natural forests, but also banana plantation and a number of other things. And I wonder if the original question was related to deforestation of natural forests as a function of population growth and not necessarily forest cover overall. Because I can see how, I don't know, banana plantations and other things are not related to population growth, but perhaps deforestation of natural ecosystem is. So I wonder if you were able to tease out somehow what you mean by change of forest.
It's a great question. So we can talk later. I will refer you to a paper that pertains to National Academy that our team published last year. We kind of teased some of these effects out by biome and helped to explain some of the differences. So spatio-temporal scale is a useful analytical lens to examine these coupled processes in terms of the household as producer and consumer. So started big, now I'm going to focus in a little bit smaller, household level. In terms of these transitions, if we're talking about the rural household, if they're in a given area, they can respond multiphasically to pressures of all kinds by deciding to change their land management, regulate fertility, or out-migrating. For example, when they migrate, they can choose different destinations, urban, international, potentially. When they choose another rural destination, to the extent that it is a more rural location, and that's often the case, if they're looking for farmland, then now they're in a new location, so we start again. When they go to another rural destination, the land management strategy is going to be much more likely to be extensive rather than intensive, because people are taking, basically investing what they have, which is land and labor, as opposed to what they don't have, capital and technological investments. So this has implications for patterns on the land. I think it's useful to distinguish at a landscape scale between internal versus external forest frontiers. In this sort of poverty-driven forest conversion trends, this often targets sort of the unoccupied frontier, this external frontier. Commercial agriculture is more likely to superimpose itself over land that's been consolidated, fallowed, land that has already been settled. And this would be the internal frontier. So land change within places that are essentially already have been converted. Wow, I'm going to really run out of time, so I'm just going to skip through the Guatemala study, where we basically found evidence of both the pathway 1 and pathway 2. And I want to get into my own research that I've been doing for nearly 20 years in Guatemala, which is, I think, a more interesting story for me to tell. So, been doing work since the mid-90s in the Sierra de la Candón National Park, looking at population and land use interactions. And this is a core conservation zone of the Maya Biosphere Reserve. And this forms the heart of the Selva Maya, which is the largest lowland rainforest in Mesoamerica. So prima facie, this appears to be a situation of land for people. There's a map of percent of land and forest, lots of forest here, little forest here. Land for people without land, map of population density, right? Nearly a reverse, one or the other. But I think we're going to see at the different scales that things are a bit more complex than that. The Lacandon boasts the richest biodiversity in the Maya Reserve. This is the Naranjo Road in 1987. This was built in the mid-'80s by oil concerns to reach the Mexican border to tap some new oil reserves. This is forest. This is the Lacandon. This became the national park in the early 90s. And you can see that in '87 there are a few farms riding up along the road. In And if you fix your gaze on this bend in the road here, that is here, and this is a composite Landsat TM image of deforestation in the 90s. During the 90s, about 10% of the park was deforested, but patterns are different. These modeled patterns are typical imprints of a extensive swidden fallow of maize. Each one of these blotches is a household, more or less. This blotch is also a household, but it's different land use. This is cattle. I wondered, through the mid-2000s, are people going to continue to settle further into the forest? And yes, they did, as noted by this pattern here. So roads, in a sense, collapsed space. Just in a matter of a few years, we went from this bumpy dirt road to a paved road with differing now market access as well. I did interviews in 1998 with a few hundred households in the Lacandon. Followed up those surveys through the work of a grad student, Laurel Sitter, in 2008, and followed up with 247 of the 244 of the 247 original households. We did surveys in Spanish, and about a third of the farmers are Kekchi Maya, so we did surveys also in Kekchi. This is what a typical farm looked like, the mean farm in 1998, about 35 hectares, still lots of forest in the internal frontier, very extensive fallow, mostly for maize. Few farmers had pasture, so this is part of, emerging in the mean a little bit. Well, just 10 years later, we see that fallow has greatly expanded, pasture has mushroomed, and there's very little forest left on the internal frontier. That's a very dramatic forest change in about 10 years. So what are some of the demographic and health factors related? In a multi-level model, larger communities were associated with more agricultural expansion during the 90s. 8 births per woman was more or less what we were estimating for a TFR. Larger households were conducting a more expansive swidden and did have a greater footprint at the farm scale. The in-migration was nearly 10% per annum during the mid-90s. That was a big factor. This is prima facie a place, when you have TFR of 8, that is scarcely or not even begun yet the demographic transition. What is a way to test if that's actually true? Any ideas? Desired family size. And I didn't know what I'd find. Interestingly, it was about 3 or 4 for women and about 5 or 6 for men. So, this has great implications for what more equitable gender equality can have for not just fertility and for maternal child health, but also for land. There are more than demographic and health factors involved. There are political, economic, of course. Those communities that are closer to the provincial capital get more access to assistance, but most people live in squatter areas in the middle of the park, such as this. And for any of you who are familiar with the ag econ literature, we found kind of a perverse incentive here for forest clearing, which was unexpected. That land title actually was related with more agricultural expansion. Of course, the ag economists think that, well, you give people their land title, then they want to invest in their land over time, gives them that longer time horizon, conserve that land. The converse happened. Any ideas why?
Lack of education.
Well, I think that is important also. But sort of a direct cause was that with land title, they were able to avail themselves of bank credit. With the bank credit, they purchased cattle. There are ecological factors. So population growth is high, but population density is low. So there's relative forest abundance, and you have expansive swidden and avoidance of farming steep slopes, for example. Maya farmers, there's some cultural differences. Maya farmers did tend to be more expansive in their swidden, but less likely to have cattle in the short term. So over time, they're probably having less of an impact on the forest. And this is an old Mayan ruin that has just been uncovered by Sweden Milpa farmers. So we also then followed up in 2009 about the migration question. This is a dynamic frontier. Are people remaining? The forest changing quickly. Once we saw that there's very little forest left in the internal frontier. So then what happens once the internal frontier is exhausted? What do people do? Do they intensify production, or do they try to find new land? And within 10 years, we see that there was quite a bit of mobility. Only about 62% of people remained in the same town, and about 10% had moved already to a new frontier within 10 years. That might sound like a small number, but when you consider that frontier migrants, in Guatemala, probably comprises far less than 1% of the population. We're seeing already a selection process for frontier migrants. Not surprising. Little to no education, and the skills are in frontier farming. And the household formation is at 15 to 20 years as opposed to 30 to 35 years, say, in the United States. In terms of the migrants, adult out migrants, again, many are going to nearby frontier, and incredibly, this was really surprising us, quite a few now are going to the U.S. and sending remittances back, and what could be the impact of this on land change. So to move towards some sort of denouement here, because we're going to run out of time soon. We want some time for questions. When I did these regression models to try to understand forest clearing in the Lacandon, depending on what variables we use, we do the multi-level, community level, household level, we're getting R squareds at 60–70% of the variation is explained. Okay, for changes on the internal frontier, like deforestation of the farm. But there is, of course, a 100% correlation between people being there at all and forest clearing. And you can say that about any forest clearing, right? I mean, you need people. It's a necessary condition. But when you're talking about a context in which nobody lived here as recently as the early 80s, it's a pretty direct cause, isn't it? That there are people at all. So to understand really that what was an external frontier up until quite recently, the obvious question to pursue was, why did people move there? And from where? And so using 3 different data sources, Guatemalan census, my own data, and some DHS data that I helped design for the 10, these sources triangulated certain areas that were quite randomly distributed actually throughout Guatemala. People were coming from different places. Visited about 30 of the municipalities of highest out-migration to the frontier, defined as the Petén, because it's needle and haystack, we say, migration just to Black and Dome. And of course, there's some structural issues going on, which are, in a sense, a common denominator throughout Guatemala. You have, a country that's the size of Ohio, same population more or less as Ohio, but Ohio has several large cities. Guatemala is 50% rural, and you have just a couple percent of the population controlling upwards of 2/3 of the rural land holdings. So you have real population land pressures, protracted civil war in the 90s, over 1 million people displaced, high poverty, population growth. So there's these pressures throughout Guatemala for rural out-migration. But nonetheless, the vast majority of migrants, individually, despite this structure, decide not to migrate. They remain where they are. And those that do, a small fraction move to the frontier, a very small fraction. So who are these people? Understanding them, it seems to me, has some pretty important implications, not only for understanding these populations for which we have very little data, for therefore understanding the future population size and distribution of our planet, but also for their outsized impacts on forest transitions, outsized per capita and per household. And so here we're looking now at this part of the multifaceted model, household model. So these were the municipalities that we visited, a few communities in each. And as you can see, during the 90s, only about 10% of men and women out-migrated in these areas of high out-migration to the frontier. And of those 10%, only about 1/3 went to the frontier. So, I mean, this is pretty incredible, really, when you think about it. That, again, there's a lot of inexactness to this, right? I mean, I have to admit this. I mean, this is hard to do, this kind of research, rural migration in this way. But nonetheless, our best estimates were that in these areas of highest outmigration at the municipal level to the frontier areas of Petén, less than 5%, 35% and 10%, moved to the frontier in the areas selected for this. So we're talking about a tiny, tiny population having a huge impact. And this is not only the case in Guatemala, it's the case, as we saw in the Andes, and certainly it remains the case in parts of Africa and also Southern Asia. So why do people migrate to the Maya Biosphere Reserve? Many of the factors that predicted land change for farmers when they were on the frontier also were the largest predictors of their migration in the first place. The biggest one, the biggest migration push, was the biggest predictor of deforestation on the frontier: land availability. It's the same variable, it's just a different magnitude of the variable. On the frontier in the Lacandon, more land availability was the largest predictor in the regression models of land expansion and deforestation. In origin areas, lack of land or landlessness was the main predictor for outmigration in the first place. But there were also other factors. Outmigrants to the frontier, as opposed to non-migrants or migrants to other areas, tended to be in more hazardous locations ecologically. They tended to be in areas where that had experienced a lot of land consolidation. They tended to be poorer, less educated, and larger, and more likely to be indigenous. And for any of you who speak Spanish, que de más, that's for another. This is in southern littoral of Guatemala, which is dominated by sugarcane and large corporations, Pepsi, Cola, Coca-Cola. Very little land available there for small farmers. So I apologize that I present some of this in your class, but for those who, well, you're the only one I guess here. So, you know, again at a different scale. We talked about household, we talked about national and regional. Let's talk about just now just a couple different case studies. So we had some certain common denominators that were sort of population/land resource pressures that contributed to outmigration to the Lacandon throughout rural Guatemala. But these things developed differently in different places. And here's just a couple examples of that. In Morales, 1950s, it grew faster than any municipality in Guatemala. It more than doubled. Why? Because United Fruit had expanded their operations there. It's post-World War II, boom in demand from Europe and North America for bananas and other, and now also with enhanced transportation, refrigeration technologies. And the location was wonderful to access European and North American markets. So Morales had a huge influx of migrant workers during the 50s to meet this demand for increased crop production. However, within a couple decades, by the late 70s, Morales was an area of high outmigration to the earlier frontiers of southern Petén, and then ultimately to the Lacandon. Why? Because even if we basically provided jobs for twice the number of people in Morales, even if we divided up the land, took half the land back from United Fruit, and distributed to farmers, there just wasn't enough available land for farmers who required subsistence land as well, because the work on the corporate plantations is often seasonal, and so it's inadequate for subsistence survival. Conversely, so jobs in themselves was not the answer in Morales. So what about land distribution? In Nueva Concepcion, 1952, it was one of two municipalities in Guatemala where there was land distribution following Jacobo Arben's dream to do this. And he was assassinated in 1952, but following his assassination, it did happen, the land redistribution in two municipalities. Nueva Concepcion was one. Households were given 28 hectares, and by the mid-90s, those 28 hectares had dwindled to an average of 3 hectares. There was no land consolidation in the intervening period in Nueva Concepcion, but rather a fertility rate exceeding 6 during that time period meant that the plots had splintered essentially to a fraction of their original size. This despite rapid outmigration, not only to the frontier of Petén, but also to the United States. So in Nueva Concepcion, land distribution in itself wasn't the answer. clearly a package of these things are important. So those are just two reasons why place matters as well. Hopefully trying to infuse some appreciation of the different scales, the important scales, from household to community to municipio, region, and global. So is this a sunrise or sunset over Latin America's for us? You know, as I thought when I came to this stop sign that says 2 ways this way, 1 way this way, I remain unsure, but I do have a strong sense that how many people eating what, produced where, and how, and will describe not only so much of the world's future health, needs to be their nutrition, but also the vast majority of the world's forest landscape or agricultural landscape. Thank you.